The Angolan Civil War began on the same day the country was born. November 11th, 1975 was supposed to be Angola's Independence Day, the moment a country that had been a Portuguese colony for 500 years finally became free. Instead, the moment Portugal lowered its flag, 3 different Angolan armies were already shooting at each other for control of the country that had just been born. The civil war that began that day would last 27 years. 500,000 people would die. 4 million would be displaced from their homes. Angola would become the most heavily mined country on Earth, with an estimated 15 million landmines buried in its soil by the war's end. And it would be fought not just by Angolans, but by Cuban soldiers, South African troops, Soviet advisors, American CIA operatives, Zairian military units, and mercenaries from across the world. Because Angola was not simply a civil war, Angola was the Cold War's most savage battlefield. The place where the United States and the Soviet Union chose to fight their global confrontation through the bodies of African people. To understand the Angolan Civil War, you first need to understand what Angola was at the moment of its independence and why its destruction was so avoidable and so complete. Angola is a country of extraordinary natural wealth. Its oil fields made it one of the richest oil-producing nations in sub-Saharan Africa. Its diamond deposits were among the largest in the world. Its agricultural land was fertile enough to have made it a major exporter of coffee, cotton, and sisal during the colonial period. But at independence, Angola had also been systematically underdeveloped by Portuguese colonialism in ways that made the post-independence conflict almost inevitable. The Portuguese had invested in infrastructure for the extraction of resources rather than the development of the population. Literacy rates among black Angolans at independence were estimated at around 15%. Less than 1,000 Angolans had university degrees at the moment of independence. The country of roughly 6 million people had been prepared for extraction, not for self-governance. 3 men and 3 movements would determine whether Angola lived or died, and none of them were willing to share power with the others. Agostinho Neto led the MPLA, the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola. He was a physician and a poet, educated in Portugal, Marxist in his politics, urban in his base. The MPLA's great advantage was geography. It controlled Luanda, the capital. Whoever controls the capital controls the radio stations, the port, the government buildings, and in the eyes of the international community, the country. Holden Roberto led the FNLA, the National Front for the Liberation of Angola. He was the brother-in-law of Mobutu Sese Seko, the dictator of neighboring Zaire, and his movement drew its strength from the Bakongo people of northern Angola, who had ethnic and cultural connections across the border. Jonas Savimbi led UNITA, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola. He was the most charismatic of the 3 leaders, the most dangerous, and ultimately the most destructive. Savimbi had a quality that both Neto and Roberto lacked. He was genuinely, extraordinarily charismatic. People who met him, including people who should have known better, came away convinced that he was the man Angola needed. He drew his support primarily from the Ovimbandu people of the Central Plateau, Angola's largest ethnic group, giving UNITA a mass base that the other movements could not match. The 3 Angolan movements would have been dangerous enough without outside interference. With it, they became catastrophic. The Soviet Union had been supplying the MPLA with weapons since the 1960s. When it became clear in 1974 that Portugal was going to grant independence, Soviet military supplies to the MPLA increased dramatically. Then Cuba arrived. Fidel Castro sent Cuban combat troops to Angola in November 1975, thousands of them, then tens of thousands. At the peak of Cuban involvement, approximately 50,000 Cuban soldiers were deployed in Angola. The United States responded by backing the FNLA and UNITA through the CIA. South Africa responded by invading Angola from the south. Angola had become, before its first year of independence was over, the battlefield of a war between the United States and the Soviet Union fought through African and Cuban proxies. By early 1976, the first phase of the Angolan Civil War had produced a winner. But the war was far from over. The combination of Cuban combat troops, Soviet equipment, and MPLA organizational capacity had defeated both the FNLA and the South African intervention in the field. The FNLA essentially ceased to be a significant military force after 1976. Holden Roberto's movement, deprived of American support after the Clark Amendment and unable to sustain itself militarily, faded from the conflict. But UNITA was different. Jonas Savimbi took his movement back to its base in the Central Highlands and began building something that would fight for another quarter century. Savimbi established his main base at Jamba in the far southeast of Angola, near the Namibian border. It was remote, defensible, and supplied through South African territory. The MPLA government that established itself in Luanda after 1976 faced a task of almost impossible difficulty. It was governing a country ravaged by war, with a population that was largely illiterate, an infrastructure destroyed by the departing Portuguese and the fighting of 1975 and 1976, and an economy that was theoretically rich in resources, but practically incapable of delivering those resources to the population. The oil wealth was real. By the early 1980s, Angola's offshore oil fields were producing significant revenue. But that revenue went primarily into the war, into buying more Soviet weapons, paying for Cuban troops, maintaining the security apparatus of a Marxist state fighting for its survival. The MPLA's Marxist economic policies also contributed to the agricultural collapse. Forced collectivization of farming, price controls that made commercial farming unprofitable, and the disruption of marketing networks destroyed Angola's food production capacity. Angola, which had been a net food exporter under Portuguese rule, became dependent on food aid within a decade of independence. Jonas Savimbi was one of the most remarkable and most destructive figures in African political history. He had a doctorate from Switzerland. He spoke 6 languages. He was physically imposing, intellectually formidable, and capable of extraordinary personal charm. He was also a man who ruled his movement through terror, who ordered the execution of rivals and their families, who used child soldiers, and who pursued the war with a personal ferocity that made peace impossible as long as he lived. UNITA under Savimbi developed a distinctive strategy for the 1980s. Rather than trying to capture and hold territory in the conventional sense, UNITA attacked the economic infrastructure that sustained the MPLA government. UNITA destroyed the Benguela Railway, a line that connected the copper-producing interior of Central Africa to the Angolan Atlantic coast, so thoroughly that it ceased to function for over a decade. In the early 1980s, the Reagan administration reversed the Clark Amendment restrictions and resumed American support for UNITA. The Stinger missiles that the CIA provided to UNITA changed the military balance significantly. Government aircraft could no longer operate with impunity over the Angolan countryside, limiting the MPLA's ability to supply its forces and attack UNITA positions. South Africa's involvement deepened into major military operations. Operation Askari in 1983 and 1984 saw large South African Defense Force units operating deep inside Angola, fighting Cuban and MPLA forces and supporting UNITA. The Battle of Cuito Cuanavale in 1987 to 1988 was a turning point. South African forces and UNITA failed to capture the town despite months of sustained assault. Cuba reinforced its commitment with additional troops and advanced aircraft. The military stalemate pushed all parties toward negotiation. In 1988, South Africa, Cuba, and Angola signed the New York Accords. South Africa agreed to withdraw from Angola and grant independence to Namibia. Cuba agreed to withdraw its troops from Angola. The foreign forces began to leave, and the Angolans were left alone with their war. The 1991 Bessès Accords were supposed to end the Angolan Civil War. The agreement was signed in Bessès, Portugal, mediated by Portugal, the United States, and Russia. It called for a ceasefire, the cantonment and demobilization of both armies, and multi-party elections to be held in 1992. The elections were held in September 1992. They were judged by international observers to be largely free and fair. The MPLA received approximately 49% of the vote. UNITA received approximately 40%. Savimbi refused to accept the result. Within days of the result announcement, UNITA forces were attacking government positions across the country. The war had restarted. In Luanda, the aftermath of the election's collapse turned into a massacre. On October 31, 1992, government forces and MPLA supporters began killing UNITA members and supporters in Luanda. The killing continued for days. The Halloween massacre claimed thousands of lives. UNITA responded by seizing territory across Angola. In months, UNITA controlled approximately 70% of Angola's landmass. They also captured and laid siege to major cities. Huambo, Angola's second largest city, was besieged and bombarded for 55 days. The siege of Huambo killed an estimated 10,000 people and reduced the city to rubble. The United Nations estimated that in 1993, alone approximately 1,000 Angolans were dying every day from the combined effects of combat, landmines, and starvation. In 1994, the Lusaka Protocol brought another ceasefire. Again, there was hope. Again, the hope was short-lived. The late 1990s brought a new phase of the war that would prove to be its last. The MPLA government had been transformed in the 1990s in ways that made it both more capable and more corrupt. Angola became one of the most corrupt states in Africa. The oil revenues that should have funded reconstruction and development were systematically diverted. But they also funded a military that was growing stronger every year. UNITA was simultaneously weakening. The UN Security Council imposed sanctions on UNITA diamonds in 1998, cutting off the primary funding source for the organization. The regional environment also changed. Mobutu's Zaire had collapsed in 1997. The new Democratic Republic of Congo, under Laurent Kabila, was hostile to UNITA. South Africa under Mandela was diplomatically hostile. UNITA was becoming isolated. In 2001 and early 2002, the Angolan government launched a final military campaign against UNITA that was different from all the previous campaigns. Previous campaigns had always stopped short of final destruction. This one did not. Government forces tracked UNITA's mobile headquarters through the bush with a persistence that Savimbi had never faced before. On February 22, 2002, Jonas Savimbi was caught in an ambush in the bush of Moxico province. He was killed, shot multiple times. The man who had fought for 27 years, who had destroyed 2 peace agreements, who had consumed Angola for a generation, was dead. Without Savimbi, UNITA had no reason to continue. On April 4, 2002, the Luena Memorandum was signed. The ceasefire was agreed. The war was over. The numbers that historians use to describe the cost of the Angolan Civil War are almost too large to comprehend. Between 500,000 and 1 million Angolans died in the conflict. The range exists because nobody kept adequate records, and many deaths occurred in areas too remote to document. 4 million people, more than a third of Angola's total population, were displaced from their homes at various points during the conflict. 15 million landmines were estimated to have been buried in Angolan soil, one of the highest concentrations of landmines in the world. Clearing them would take decades. Angola's infrastructure had been systematically destroyed. Roads, bridges, railways, hospitals, schools, water systems. All of it had either been destroyed in the fighting or had simply collapsed from neglect during 27 years of war. And yet Angola also had something remarkable: oil. In the years after the ceasefire, Angola experienced one of the fastest economic growth rates in the world. The oil revenues poured in. Luanda was rebuilt. New infrastructure was constructed. But the wealth did not reach most Angolans. The same elite that had managed the war managed the peace. Angola became famous both for its oil wealth and for the extraordinary inequality between its ruling class and its population. The Angolan Civil War ended in 2002, but its consequences, in the landmines still being found in fields, in the generation that grew up knowing nothing but war, in the institutional dysfunction of a state that organized itself for conflict rather than governance, were still being felt decades later. 500,000 people. 27 years. 3 liberation movements. 2 superpowers. Cuba. South Africa. And a single man who refused to accept the result of a democratic election. The Angolan Civil War was not inevitable. It was chosen, again and again, by powerful men. Savimbi, the American presidents who backed him, the Soviet general secretaries who armed the MPLA, the South African leaders who sent their soldiers north. It was chosen over the alternative. Angola deserved better. It still does.